Fresh fighting intensifying in eastern Ukraine and more attacks inside Russian territory as speculation grows about Kyiv's counteroffensive. Is the war in Ukraine entering a critical stage or just another phase with no end in sight? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. New fronts in the Ukraine war. Anti-Kremlin armed groups launching attacks in border regions, drone and artillery strikes further into Russian territory, and near daily bombardment of the Ukrainian capital. Civilians in both countries are bearing the brunt as the war drags on. We'll be exploring the latest developments and the prospects of this conflict coming to an end with our guests in a few moments. But first, Charles Stratford has this report from Kyiv.
What we've seen in the last few days and weeks is an escalation by both sides, really, of what we understand are attempts to target supply lines and weapons stores. The Ukrainians coming under heavy bombardments of cruise missiles and so-called kamikaze drones by the Russians in various locations across the country, and the Ukrainians targeting what we understand are supply lines, for example, in northern Crimea and in that port city of Berdyansk on the Azov Sea, which was occupied by the Russians in the early stages of the war. We understand that these moves are all in relation to the build-up for this long-expected Ukrainian counter-offensive, a counter-offensive that analysts will tell you is going to be a huge challenge to the Ukrainians. They talk about fears that the spread of some of this weaponry that has been supplied by Ukraine's allies along a 1,000-kilometre front line could be a bit thin. They are also concerned about the element of surprise. Of course, this has been planned for months. It's given the opportunity to the Russians to dig in deep defensive positions in various areas, and we've seen satellite imagery of that. Analysts also talk about the difference between sequential and simultaneous military manoeuvres. Up until now, both sides have used what they say are sequential moves. That's basically the use of artillery and what air power they've got, for example, to bombard areas in the enemy's territory before then moving forward with infantry. Analysts are saying now what's needed is more of a simultaneous attack that is a lot more complex, bringing in various different strands of the military, takes a lot more planning, is a lot more risky. And to give you an example about just what kind of threats the Ukrainians potentially are facing, analysts say that the kill ratio in a situation like this is very much always in the defender's favour. Of course, that's Russia in this instance, a kill ratio of around 3 to 1. So there are fears by analysts about manpower, about getting the Ukrainian forces, getting as many of them as they can to operate this mammoth task. One thing's for sure, though, is that Ukraine's allies want results after having invested so many tens of billions of dollars worth of military equipment and training what we understand are tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. They want to see results. And there are many people saying that the outcome of this counteroffensive will determine the outcome of the war. Charles Stratford for Inside Story, Kyiv.
Ukraine's military capability before the war was dwarfed by Russia's, but the international community has changed that. At least 40 countries have made significant donations. The U.S. is by far the largest contributor, sending weapons, ammunition, and military equipment worth $46 billion by the end of February this year. The U.K. is the second biggest donor. Its assistance amounts to $7 billion and includes fighter jet training. Germany's support involves armored personnel carriers, drones, and Leopard 2 battle tanks, a package totaling $3.8 billion to date. While Poland has sent equipment and ammunition worth $2.6 billion, it also plays a vital role in logistical efforts to deliver international military aid to Ukraine. Let's take a look at some of the recent developments on the ground. The commander of Ukraine's ground forces says his troops are advancing on Russian-occupied Bakhmut in the east. Moscow announced it had taken the city in May after months of brutal fighting with thousands of casualties on both sides. Elsewhere in the Donetsk region, Russia says its forces have stopped a major Ukrainian offensive. Part of Donetsk is under Russian occupation. The rest is still under Ukrainian control. Pro-Ukraine armed groups have attacked the Russian border region of Belgorod, which has been bombarded over the past week. Kyiv is denying involvement. All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. In Moscow, we're joined by Pavel Felgenhauer, a defense and military analyst. In Athens is Despina Afentouli, executive director at the Institute of International Relations, specializing in foreign policy and European affairs. And in Bath, in the UK, is Patrick Bury, a defense and security analyst at the University of Bath and a former British Army officer. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Patrick, let me start with you today. Is what we're witnessing now the start of the Ukrainian counteroffensive? Is that what we're seeing?
I think so, yes. It's the next phase. The first phase was what we call the shaping phase, where Ukraine was trying to set the conditions as best as possible to facilitate the next phase. And this phase is basically reconnaissance and force probing. They're using their ground forces, especially in the southeast, in the division between the Zaporizhia and Donetsk oblasts. They're attacking around a town called Novodonetsk, and they've had some success there already. Some reports, credible reports, suggest 5 to 6 kilometers they've advanced since yesterday. And so I think that's where we are. They're not committing all their forces. They're attacking actually in a number of different places, some to the north of Bakhmut as well. And they're basically, because they are a smaller force, they're trying to find a weak spot, probe, draw Russian forces away, and then they would get their heavier forces and try and exploit any breakthrough that they can make.
Patrick, I also want to ask you about what we're seeing in terms of far-right Russians allied to Kyiv that have been launching these cross-border attacks into Russia, and also the drone attacks that have been hitting cities like Moscow. Do you expect that that's going to continue?
Well, the Belgorod raids in that area are essentially that. They're raids by the two, the Volunteer Corps and the Foreign Legion. The Volunteer Corps much less seems controlled than the Legion, which is sort of fighting hand in hand with the Ukrainians. But yet they're there. The design, of course, is to embarrass the Putin regime, to create uncertainty in the border area, and also to force Russia to send more troops there to drag them away from other areas where the offensive is going to be trying to break through. So that's what's going on there. I would expect that to continue. We've seen it basically continuing now for a few days. Those forces will have to retreat and refit after a while, but their job at the moment is to create as much havoc as they can. And in terms of the drone attack on Moscow, I think that was basically tit for tat for the heavy wave of attacks that Kiev had experienced. And then the Ukrainian general had said, you can expect us to hit back. And the next morning, you know, there was between 8 and probably more like 30 drones flying into southwest Moscow. A number of them were shot down, but some of them weren't. And I think the target there was really at the elites, the Russian elites who live in that area, as opposed to the ordinary Russian people. The Ukrainians trying to bring the war home to especially those elites, and also maybe sow some divisions. Sorry.
Pavel, let me get your view on this. So when it comes to drone strikes that have hit Moscow, when it comes to far-right Russians allied to Kyiv that have been launching attacks across the border, first of all, how does that change things? And you heard Patrick there say that some of this is meant to embarrass President Putin. Is it an embarrassment for him?
Oh, yes, it is an embarrassment that caused quite a stir in public opinion in Moscow, that Moscow is also vulnerable to Ukrainian attack, though, of course, these were, well, rather small drones, and no one got really seriously injured, and it was minor damage. It was a kind of part of a psychological, I would say, warfare. And more or less the same with the trans-border raids by these auxiliary units, which are also creating problems, though not really grabbing or holding any kind of territory on the Russian side, but that's not their objective. Again, they most likely, Ukrainians hope that they could draw some Russian reserves from the main battlefield that's going in the south, where the now in the summer campaign, everything's going to be decided. I believe the outcome of the whole conflict is going to be decided this summer in the south of Ukraine.
Pavel, let me also ask you, Ukrainian counteroffensive, this has been talked about for quite a while now. Russia obviously has had time to prepare. How prepared is Russia?
Well, everyone has been preparing for the summer campaign. How they're prepared and how effective we will see on the battlefield. The Ukrainians want to break this bloody gridlock, go mobile, and achieve victory during the summer campaign, which begins now and can last till October something. Where it's dry summer weather, you can move heavy equipment, trucks and tanks and other heavy stuff over fields and dirt roads. You can go mobile. Last autumn, the Ukrainians managed a spectacular mobile offensive in the Kharkiv region. They're trying to pull something maybe bigger now. They have more equipment. The Russians have right now more troops. The Russians are preparing to stop the Ukrainian offensive, give them a bloody nose, heavy casualties, a small success, and then maybe Ukraine will be ready to end this war on Russian terms, which basically means a freeze of the present status quo, a frozen conflict.
Despina, obviously we can't have this discussion without talking about NATO. From your perspective, what is NATO's view of what is currently happening?
I think that I am not a NATO officer anymore, but certainly, I can interpret the alliance's positions. We have here some facts on the ground, and these facts are in favor of Ukraine. Ukraine has a moral advantage in this conflict. They are fighting for their country, for their territory. They have the support of the Western countries, US and other NATO allies. I think NATO is adamant. Secretary Stoltenberg has repeated it very often, that we will stand by Ukraine as long as it takes.
Patrick, let me ask you a question about the fact that the West, NATO as well, they've supplied all these modern weapons to Ukraine. But one thing I'm curious about, how complicated are they to use? Because we talk about tanks being delivered. We talk about perhaps F-16s at some point being given to Ukraine. Is training being provided?
Well, yeah, actually on both of them. To be honest with you, the training for the tank crews has already happened, and it happens in Europe, and those forces have gone back to Ukraine with their tanks. There's 230 Western tanks supplied to Ukraine, which they have inside the country now. Over 1,500 armored infantry fighting vehicles. The thing with the tanks, like in terms of the logistics, it's because they're different variants. There's more Leopards, but there's also the Challenger 2s and Abrams in there as well, the US Abrams. It varies, they've got different logistical chains and different needs, and that when you don't have standardization, that is just a bit of a pain logistically. But it's not impossible. And it does, it does actually all come down to logistics. I wouldn't be surprised if there was, independent contractors hired in to help them, who have the expertise, who and know all the parts and the workings of these, because that's another way.
Patrick, I did want to follow up with you about that specific point. Do you believe that there are specialists or contractors or former military officers from Western countries that are currently on the ground in Ukraine helping either to operate or to repair this equipment?
I don't know. Is a short answer. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were, because there's nothing barring that. Essentially. So that's another way of getting around the problem. The F-16 issue, the pilots are being trained in Europe and in the US as well, but that takes a fair bit of time. My understanding is if you took an English-speaking, very current, like the fighter pilot from the Ukrainian Air Force who has literally been flying his own jets up until a few weeks ago, and then started to train them on the F-16, it could take anywhere between 6 weeks and 3 to 4 months. That's about, and that would be the absolute fastest you could do it. And of course, other pilots who either have less experience or are in training, it will take longer for them to know. So it depends on the pilot, and of course, you can't just get 3 or 4 pilots to do this. You need them all to be able to do it, so the systems work together. So that will take longer. But I wouldn't be surprised if we started to see the F-16 come in towards the autumn, which there's still a bit of time for potentially another offensive. And the really interesting thing about this in terms of warfare is the West and most countries would not be fighting really the way Ukraine is. Yes, they can do combined arms in terms of artillery, drones, tanks, infantry, but we'd never commit forces without air support and even like air parity, and they don't have that at the moment. So it's a very brave thing they're doing as well.
Despina, let me get your perspective. Do you think that we're any closer to seeing potential formal mediation or formal peace talks when it comes to the Ukraine conflict, or are we farther than we've ever been from that possibility?
I think all the major powers are trying to negotiate a solution. The thing is that a solution will have winners and losers. For the time being, I can interpret the Ukrainian offensive as a very serious effort to come to negotiations with an advantage on the table. Certainly this, in my view, would be the most complex negotiation after the end of the Cold War. Similar, to the negotiation that took place in the 90s after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, because Ukraine cannot lose. But of course, they have to accept some unpleasant situation on the ground, to say the least. What Russia would accept is a question mark. I don't think Russia will accept a total defeat. And I don't know if a total defeat would be in favor of stability in Europe in general. So I see many behind the scenes negotiations for the time being, and maybe we can foresee formal negotiations by the end of the year. The problem, is that both in Europe and in the United States, by the end of the year, we will enter pre-electoral periods. For US, it's obvious they will have primaries, and for Europe, maybe, our colleagues are not so familiar with. In Europe, the leadership will change next year because of the European elections. So this is something that maybe impede a negotiation with a clear outcome.
Patrick, I want to ask you about the fact that the commander of Ukraine's ground forces has said that Ukrainian forces are moving forward near Bakhmut. From your point of view, is there a chance that Ukraine could retake Bakhmut, and what would that mean in all of this?
Well, firstly, I totally would agree with what Despina said. I think that's all spot on. In terms of Bakhmut, there does, for example, in the last 24 hours, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner PMC, has said that he handed over a village just north of Bakhmut to the Russian army, and then the Russian army withdrew under pressure from the Ukrainians. So we'll have to see exactly what the situation is there, but it's certainly not stable. And judging by, I don't even know if Yevgeny Prigozhin is stable, judging by his rants on social media, but the front there does not seem to be as stable as the Russians would like. It is possible, and again, that would be a political, because it's been so symbolic and it's been invested in so much human capital in terms of deaths for Russia, turned into something much bigger than it actually was, it needed to be in terms of military strategy. That would be a blow for Putin as well. So, and we've seen fighting to the north of there as well, and shelling in Solidar, etc. So we'll just have to see, but it would make perfect sense to, for example, from a military perspective, to try to encircle or go even further behind with a pincer behind Bakhmut, and then start moving behind the flanks either to the north or to the south. That would make perfect military sense. So it just is a question of whether the defences are too strong there or not.
Pavel, I'm curious from your perspective to know, is there any willingness on the part of the Russian government to try to enter any kind of mediation or formal peace talks when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, or is that a non-starter at this point?
Well, the official line of the Kremlin is that Russia is ready to basically negotiate, but right now there's no one to negotiate with. The present Ukrainian leadership is not ready to negotiate anything from the Russian point of view, because Russia demands that more or less what Russia has taken, and reunited with the motherland, should be recognized as Russian territory, meaning Crimea, the Donbass, and parts of Zaporozhye and Kherson. So basically, it's kind of freezing the present status quo. That's what Russia would more or less want, and what Ukraine does not want at all. And apparently in Europe also not all, many don't want that either, to kind of reward, as they say, Russia. So that means right now it's not much talk. It's going to be fight, fight instead of talk. It will be decided on the battlefield of this summer campaign, how things turn out by autumn, and when the autumn rain turn everything into a sea of mud, and mobile warfare is impossible again. I believe, yes, negotiations can begin, but right now the terms on which they could be held are totally not fully understood, because first we'll have to see how this campaign goes through.
Despina, what must the level of concern be among EU member states right now? At the start of the conflict, did anyone think this would last this long?
I think it's very high, the level of concern, because of the prolonged conflict and because of the uncertainty about the end of this conflict. Maybe it's not a direct consequence, the inflation in Europe, but it's still a big problem. Prices are not going down, energy prices as well. So I think that the public opinion in Europe is going to get tired from the prolonged conflict. And this can lead to indifference because, as I said, European elections are planned in May 2024. And European elections are not of great interest in Europe anyway, but the leadership of the European institutions will change. So I don't know if they will have the appetite and the dynamism and the political legitimacy to go on to the table of negotiation and provide a solution, because EU has to be part of the solution. They have to offer a carrot to Ukraine. They don't have to isolate Russia, on the other hand, because otherwise they will create a black hole in Europe. So it is very complicated, and I'm afraid we don't see any very clear positions on behalf of the European Union.
Pavel, you heard Despina there talking about public opinion in Europe. I'm curious to know about where public opinion stands in Russia right now. And also, what is the situation in Russia right now when it comes to the economic sanctions that have been imposed?
Well, economic sanctions, of course, have a very serious effect. So the Russian economy, in terms, say, of GDP, is not, and inflation is not that really bad as it could have been. There's a lot of defense spending, which means that GDP is growing, as it always does in any kind of war situation. So right now, the public opinion basically supports the war effort, supports the government, supports President Putin. But what happens if there are serious Russian problems on the battlefield? That could change dramatically. But if it continues as it is right now, the line that Russia should fight on and go to negotiations from a position of strength to kind of secure the present situation and have a kind of ceasefire, a frozen situation, that's going to be more or less supported. I believe, yes, by the end of the year, there will be some kind of pause in the fighting. Simply, both sides will run out of arms and munitions largely. There's crisis of logistics on both sides. So some kind of pause is coming, but it will come after a very vicious summer campaign.
Despina, if the counteroffensive is not as successful for Ukraine as they would like, how much more pressure will be applied by the EU, by the US, by NATO for President Zelensky and his colleagues to enter into negotiations with President Putin?
First of all, the success of an operation has its own narrative. I mean, Ukrainians can say that the offensive would be successful. and Russians would contradict this assumption. Certainly, we are not talking here about big victories or big defeats. You see how it's going on the ground, step by step. I have the impression that US and Europe are pushing, to which extent I don't know, but they would like to see a negotiating solution. And so I believe that they have made clear to the Ukrainian leadership their views. On the other hand, the leadership is that of a sovereign country. So to which extent, I mean, the pressure can be effective, it's a question. But let's see, I mean, how it goes for the time being. If it is successful enough, then maybe indeed we can have some change of attitude.
Pavel, when it comes to weapons stockpiles, where do things stand currently for Russia?
Well, Russia has still a lot of weapons that can be used, but there are some problems, of course, with procurement. They're using Soviet stockpiles, which are usable, but the Ukrainians are getting increasingly very sophisticated weapons. They're getting, in some respect, an upper hand, though they still don't have an air force that can challenge anyway the Russians in the air, but they can at least deny the Russian Air Force flight capabilities deep into Ukrainian-controlled territory. So that's also very important. So both sides have weapons right now ready for this campaign and can carry it on, but the problems come up later on when there's a crisis of armaments, of munitions in the West. It's a lot of talk about that. There's also some problems with that in Russia. I believe the present intensity of fighting cannot be sustained indefinitely. I think there's going to be a pause somewhere closer to the end of the year, inevitably, which will maybe some kind of tentative ceasefire action.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Pavel Felgenhauer and Despina Afentouli, and Patrick Bury, who joined us earlier. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed, Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.